Good morning. Welcome to day 3 of Ignite. Thank you for coming to our early morning session. I hope you all have your coffee or tea, and let's get started. I'm Daniel Lee. I'm a program manager on the Windows Admin Center team for Windows Server. I'm here with Cosmos today. He will be introducing himself later. Today we'll be covering Hyper-V management in Windows Admin Center, what's new in the past year. We'll also be talking about the basics of hyper-converged infrastructure and the value that it provides. We'll be doing demos through Windows Admin Center as well. Today's session is not going to be a deep dive of Store Spaces Direct or software-defined networking. We have separate sessions tomorrow on these two topics. So a lot that we're going to talk about today is going to be about Windows Admin Center. Hopefully you've tried it out yourself, or at least you've heard about it, or seen a demo of Windows Admin Center in the past 2 days. But just in case you haven't, I'll do a quick intro just so that we're on the same page. Windows Admin Center is Windows Server Management reimagined. It's taking the previous legacy MMC tools and Server Manager and replacing them. It's a quick, easy install, about 60 megabytes that you can install on Windows 10 or Windows Server to manage your servers or clusters through a beautiful, user-friendly UI in your web browser. In Windows Admin Center, we're focusing on 5 main areas. The first being the core tools that I just mentioned, hyper-converged infrastructure management that we'll talk a lot about today, modern security built in, such as RBAC and Azure Azure AD integration, and built for hybrid environments with integration with Azure, and working with hardware and software partners to build extensions for their products. There's a lot of stuff that we won't cover today, and we have an entire session for 75 minutes later today at 4 p.m. I hope you don't miss it. So we talked about Windows Admin Center. Let's talk about Hyper-V. And why are we building a new Hyper-V UI? There are really 2 big reasons. First, Hyper-V, our telemetry shows us that Hyper-V is one of the top used roles in Windows Server 2016. And if you look at just clusters, then it's the #1 deployed role. And also, if you look at Windows Admin Center telemetry, of all the tools that we have, Hyper-V is the most commonly used tool across all our tools. The second reason we need a better Hyper-V UI is because you told us so. If you look at Hyper-V Manager feedback on user voice, the top request is a new integrated UI for Hyper-V Manager, bringing Hyper-V Manager and Failover Cluster Manager into a single experience. Another request is bringing the VM files, the VM VHD files, the VM configuration files into a single folder to make it easier to manage and maintain. Another top request, Hyper-V Manager show IOPS, and then better performance charts for network and CPU and RAM utilization, along with historical charts. So we've been working hard on building a better Hyper-V management experience in Windows Admin Center. And today I'd like to show you 3 demos and talk about 3 things. First, let's get started with the basic VM management in Windows Admin Center. So this is the inventory page for virtual machines on a server or cluster. In this case, we're connected to Contoso HCI, which is a hyper-converged cluster, but you get a very similar experience whether you're connected to a standalone server, a Hyper-V cluster, or a hyper-converged cluster. You can sort by the different columns. If you sort by host server, you can see some of the VMs are on node 1. Most of them are on node 2. We have nice bar charts for CPU usage and memory pressure, which you can sort by as well. You can also sort by, for example, memory demand to see which VMs are under the highest memory pressure. And of course, you can click on a VM, start the VM, and you get nice notifications on top right. You can also choose multiple VMs and do bulk operations such as shutdown. And again, you'll get notifications on top right. And Windows Admin Center tracks these long-running jobs so you can move on and do other tasks in the meantime. We also have commands like save, pause, resume, reset, new checkpoint, And let's take a look at VM settings. We have all the settings that you're familiar with from Hyper-V Manager. Oh, and by the way, notice that the shutdown has completed, so you're notified. And also notice that this is a running VM. So the settings, you can change all of them, but the ones that are supported by Hyper-V, we do allow you to change them in the settings. We have the security tab, memory, processors, disks, and even adding a disk is really simple. Click Add Disk, you get one. Click it again, and you get another. And notice how we're taking care of the SCSI controller and the location of the disk behind the scenes for you. Networks, boot order, and checkpoints. So all the settings that you're familiar with from Hyper-V Manager are all here in Windows Admin Center as well. You can also think of Windows Admin Center as a beautiful web UI built on top of Hyper-V PowerShell that you're familiar with. And all the PowerShell scripts that we run behind the scenes can be viewed through Windows Admin Center as well, through the new feature that we call Show PowerShell Script. In the top right, we have a PowerShell button, and if you click on it, here's a list of all the PowerShell scripts that we run for the virtual machines tool. There's a long list, but the titles are very self-descriptive. Let's choose something like Start Virtual Machine, for example. And this is the actual script that we run when you click on the Start VM button in Windows Admin Center. So there's the basics. Everything you'd expect, but built with servers and clusters in mind, and built on top of the Hyper-V Manager that you're familiar with, Hyper-V PowerShell command list that you're familiar with. We support all the way down to Windows Server 2012. So we have support for 2012, 2016, 2019. It's the same experience whether you're using desktop UI or server core. And we also support the free Hyper-V server SKU as well. So what do I mean by Hyper-V for IT admins? Hasn't it always been for IT admins the whole time? Well, actually, yes and no. It's for Hyper-V and IT admins, but also for developers. And when we looked at improving the Hyper-V management experience, we realized that these two groups of users has very different use cases. For developers, they're mostly on Windows 10. They're running one or two VMs a lot of time for test or development purposes. And you can think of VMs more like apps, sharing the CPU and memory resources along with your other apps like Outlook or VS Code or your web browser, right? And this is very different for IT admins. You're mostly running on Windows Server, you're running dozens or hundreds of VMs, and you have very specific settings for your VMs as well. So Hyper-V management is evolving into two different directions, and for IT admins, we want Windows Admin Center to be the best experience possible. So let's jump into the next demo. So I showed you the VM inventory page, and we have another summary page. It's the first tab next to it, and this shows you a high-level view from a host admin perspective. Whether you're on a server, a cluster, we provide a summary of the VMs that are running, off, saved, or paused. We have alerts from the health service, and we have Event Viewer integrated right into Windows, the virtual machines tool. You can see just the Hyper-V channels built in, and if we choose one of the channels, there's a list of all the events. I can choose them. You have the description below. And I'll click through, clicking down, 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 and see how performant and responsive it is. It's actually faster than the Event Viewer MMC running locally. You'll also notice that we're collecting the events from both nodes. So if you're connected to a cluster, then we'll collect the events from all the nodes and show them in a single view. Now, if we go back, you can also see there are CPU and memory charts showing you the host versus guest usage, and also the top VMs that are consuming the most resources as well. And below, we have IOPS, latency, and throughput charts collecting data across all your VMs. And if you're on Windows Server 2019 hyper-converged, then we have historical charts for hour, day, week, month, up to a year that's automatically collected out of the box for you. Now let's drill in and take a look at a single VM page. Now if we go back to the inventory and click on a VM, there are all the properties that you're familiar with from Hyper-V Manager. And below that, we have the performance charts again: CPU, memory, network, IOPS, latency, and throughput. And on Windows Server 2012 or 2016, you get the live data. And if you're on Windows Server 2019 hyper-converged, then you get the data, historical again, for an hour. You can hover over each of the dots to see the actual value and time. You can look at the day view, week, month, and up to a year. And again, this is collected as you create VMs and run the VMs automatically for you behind the scenes. Below that, we have checkpoints. You can apply a checkpoint, delete a checkpoint. And we also have a related section showing you the VHD files that's used by this VM. You can switch over to networks, and we'll show you the network adapter. And also a server tab that shows you which server, the host server, the VM is running on. You'll notice that for the VHD file, there's a file path, and if you click on that, it'll take you to the file explorer built into Windows Admin Center. You can see it drilling into that folder for you. And there's the folder with the VHD file. And if we go up one level, then you'll see the snapshot files, the virtual hard disk files, and the VM configuration files, all in a single folder, just like you asked for. Also, if you're on hyper-converged, then we have an open volume button. And if you click on that, this is the volume page. And below, you'll have the historical charts, again, for this volume. And this is really helpful, because if you're looking at the historical charts for a virtual machine and you see a performance hit an hour ago, you can go to the volume page, see the same charts. You can go to the server page, see the same charts. And this helps you with the troubleshooting to figure out if it's an isolated issue within just the VM, or is it caused by the volume or the server. Now let's take a look at the Create VM experience. We've talked with a lot of IT admins, a lot of users, and really tried to optimize this workflow, trying to make the settings that we show perfect, and also making sure that every click matters. In the inventory page, you can click on New, type in the VM name. It's a Gen 2 by default, but you can change it to Gen 1 if you need to. We have host recommendation. You can choose a host if you want to. We have the list of volumes. And whichever volume you choose, the VM files are placed in a single folder again. The number of processes, you can finally change them when you're creating a VM. And nested virtualization, it's a single checkbox, but Windows Admin Center is the only place where we have it enabled in the UI. For memory, you can enter numbers. Notice that it's gigabytes, it's not megabytes anymore. It's 2018, right? Network adapter, again, adding a disk is really simple. Click add, you get one disk. Click add again, you get another. Let's try installing the OS from a network with Windows deployment services. There's your new VM created. Let's start it. There you go. Once you've created a VM, what do you do next? You need to use VM Connect to connect to the VM and install the OS, right? How do you do that in Windows Admin Center? If you go into the More menu and click Connect, and type in your Hyper-V host admin credentials. This is the new VM Connect web console built into Windows Admin Center, so you can create your VM, install the OS end-to-end without ever leaving your web browser. So again, we're providing a lot of insightful visualization from a host admin perspective. We're supporting all the way down to Windows Server 2012, and we have a good experience for Windows Server 2012 or 2016. We have a better experience for Windows Server 2019 with all the new platform capabilities, and the best possible experience for Windows Server 2019 hyper-converged with the historical charts and health alerts. Now, if you've seen Windows Admin Center demos in the past 2 days here at Ignite, you might have noticed that the UI for a lot of new features are exclusively available in Windows Admin Center. And this is the same, for example, you have Storage Replica, which is only in Windows Admin Center. Storage Migration Service, which is new in Windows Server 2019. And System Insights as well. And this is the same for Hyper-V management as well. And one example is a Hyper-V scheduler and simultaneous multi-threading setting that's new in Windows Admin Center to address the L1 terminal fault vulnerability. So you probably heard about the Spectre or Meltdown attacks. And just recently, last month, Intel has released information on the L1TF vulnerability, which has impact on hypervisors and virtual machines. To explain L1TF in a nutshell, on a modern processor, you have many cores, right? And if you drill into each of those cores, with simultaneous multi-threading enabled, also known as Intel hyper-threading, you get 2 hardware threads, also known as logical processors, which share the L1 data cache. Now, if you have a VM that you have 2 logical processors assigned, then they may run on the same core on the 2 different hardware threads. But then they can also run on separate threads on different cores. Now, you don't want to keep the second thread idle and wasted, so another VM can come in and use that second thread on the first core. So in a normal case, these 2 VMs share the L1 data cache happily. But for a malicious or compromised VM, the second VM can actually access the L1 data cache for the first VM, and this is known as the L1TF attack. So in Windows Server 2016, with the August cumulative update, and on Windows Server 2019 by default, we've introduced a new scheduler type called the core scheduler. And what this does is it prevents the second VM from running on the same core. But again, you don't want to waste that second thread. So there's a VM setting which we call SMT enabled. And by enabling that, that allows the first VM to use both threads on the same core, ultimately preventing the L1TF attack without any with only minimal performance loss. So let's see what that looks like in Windows Admin Center. Whether you're connected to a server cluster, there's a settings button at the bottom left. And we have all the Hyper-V host settings that you're familiar with: general, enhanced session mode, NUMA spanning, live migration, and storage migration. There's a virtual hard disk path, VM path, and there's a new hypervisor scheduler type. And this only shows up when applicable. So you'll see that we have classic scheduler. We warn you that you should use core scheduler. Change the setting, click Save, and you're done. Also notice at the top that it says any changes will be applied to all cluster nodes. So if you're connected to a cluster and new in Windows Admin Center, any change you make for Hyper-V host is written to all the cluster nodes at once to help you keep your Hyper-V host settings consistent across the entire cluster. Now, let's take a look at how you change the guest VM setting. Again, for the VM settings and processors, we have a new Enable SMT option. Again, this only shows up when necessary. You click that, and that's it. Another thing to note is that for Windows Server 2016 VMs, the default is SMT disabled. So Windows Admin Center overrides that and lets you know when we should change that, and will automatically change it to SMT enabled for you. So there's a lot of exclusive features only available in Windows Admin Center, and one of them, again, is another one of them is VM replication with ASR, but due to limited time, I won't be able to show that today. But at our 4 p.m. session today, we'll have a lot of hybrid integration demos with Azure. So hopefully this shows you what we've done so far for Hyper-V management in Windows Admin Center and our vision to build the best Hyper-V management experience possible. With that, I'd like to hand it over to Cosmos to talk more about hyper-converged infrastructure.
Thank you, Daniel. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for making our 9 a.m. session. So far, Daniel has talked about what we're doing to try to make Windows Admin Center really the next generation of Hyper-V Manager and to make it better. I'm Cosmos. I'm going to be running the second half of the show today, and I'm going to be talking about how Windows Admin Center is also designed to meet the second goal that we've had really since the beginning of this project, which is to help Hyper-V administrators to discover and learn and grow and become comfortable with the next waves of data center technology, notably software-defined storage and software-defined networking, the things that comprise hyper-converged infrastructure. And this is a good thing to be learning because there's a revolution happening in the server market. How people deploy in their data centers, how they deploy hardware to the edge to remote offices and branch offices is changing. And if you've been following us for the last couple of years, you've probably seen this diagram before. Increasingly, people are moving from what we would call a traditional three-tier architecture to a hyper-converged architecture. They're really consolidating in a way that means you don't necessarily need the storage array, either the SAN or the NAS that you had before. You may not need the hardware appliances if you're able to replace them with software appliances, whether that's from Microsoft or from a third party. People are consolidating as they move to hyper-converged infrastructure. And there's no easier way to do this than with Windows Server 2016 or 2019, which both include Hyper-V, Storage Spaces Direct, and software-defined networking in one familiar product and license. So a lot of customers have been taking us up on this proposition and saying, okay, you've included the software-defined storage and the software-defined networking right there in Windows Server, which means if I deploy Hyper-V at scale, I've already paid for it. Right? It's just included in the data center license. It's not a separate product or a separate SKU. So a lot of folks have been taking us up on that and moving to this hyper-converged infrastructure. We announced in March, earlier this year, that there were over 10,000 clusters of Storage Spaces Direct deployed around the world. And I have the pleasure of giving you an update on that number this morning, that in just the last 6 months, that number has actually increased by another 50%, which is not just phenomenal momentum, but it's actually accelerating. So we're really humbled by that. Thank you very much. So why are people deploying hyper-converged infrastructure? What are the benefits that they really see from doing this? What's driving that revolution in the server market? And in particular, why are they choosing to do it on Windows Server? I think there are a couple of reasons, and I'd like to try to give an overview of a few of them now, and then we'll get into a little bit more of a detailed discussion of Storage Spaces Direct. The first reason is really related to the inflection point that we're at in terms of server hardware, and especially storage and networking hardware. Things like SATA SSDs or NVMe SSDs are really becoming quite mainstream. Remote direct memory access, or RDMA networking, we're now at over 5 vendors who can supply components for that. And these are technologies that were born really of hyperscale cloud, but now we can bring that technology into everyone's data center. And in so many ways, Windows Server is on the leading edge of that hardware innovation. We've supported from day one NVMe SSDs, Intel Xeon Scalable processors. For a very long time, we were the only hyper-converged platform that had RDMA support, which allows you to offload network traffic and get a lot of CPU back for your virtual machines. We support Intel Thunderbolt 3 for networking between servers, which is pretty cool. We, of course, support Intel Optane, both the SSDs and as persistent memory. And many of you may have seen that earlier this week we did a demo with Intel Optane DC persistent memory, where we took our previous industry-leading nearly 6.7 million IOPS, or storage operations per second, from a single cluster, and doubled our own record to over 13.7 million, with a cluster that was actually smaller. Rather than 16 nodes, we just needed 12. And this was, it turns out, the first time that anyone's been allowed to give a detailed performance demo of both Optane DC persistent memory and Cascade Lake generation Intel processors. So this is just sort of an example of the type of hardware innovation that is uniquely possible with hyper-converged infrastructure. Some of these technologies may someday ship in a storage array, but I wouldn't hold my breath. Another reason that hyper-converged infrastructure makes so much sense is really that opportunity to consolidate, right? You can get rid of proprietary hardware that's locked into a single vendor, like a storage array, and in its place, you get your choice of industry-standard servers and components. And as I said, with Windows Server, it's really the most affordable way to do it because included in that license that you already have for Hyper-V, you get software-defined storage, software-defined networking, management, because as I think Daniel mentioned, Windows Admin Center is not charged separately, it's just included, as well as those unlimited rights to run Windows in guest VMs. And all of this is included in the same product and license that you already know. Something else that customers tell us they love about hyper-converged infrastructure is that it enables them to standardize because of the scalability. And so you can deploy the same stack in your core data center as well as at the edge or in your remote or branch offices. So we see this quite often. Organizations will deploy a large cluster or set of clusters, 8, 12, 16 nodes. I know a customer who deployed 16 clusters of 16 nodes, and they were all flash. My thought was, that sounds expensive. But they'll deploy that in their core data center, and then in each of their branch offices, they'll deploy smaller 2-node or 3-node clusters. And they can do that and then just learn the same set of management tools once and use it in both places, which is really something that's a unique advantage of hyper-converged infrastructure in this way. We've been doing a lot of work to make sure that Windows Server has the best set of HCI capabilities for small deployments like this. So we support switchless direct connect networking, sometimes called back-to-back, so that for a small 2-node deployment, you actually do not need a switch if you don't have one in that branch office. We also have a full active-active model for both compute and storage. So if you have a 2-node cluster, virtual machines will run on both, and will do storage reads and writes from both copies of data all the time. And we have a very lightweight solution for quorum. So unlike some other solutions, we don't need like a witness virtual machine to be running somewhere. You can have a true 2-node cluster that's self-contained. We've actually been building on that advantage. So in Windows Server 2019, we've added the ability to use a USB key or a NAS as the witness, which makes it even more true that even without an internet connection, you can have just a self-contained 2-node cluster running Windows Server for hyper-converged. We also announced yesterday, and I'll be doing a demo tomorrow during the Storage Spaces Direct session, a new resiliency mode called nested resiliency, which allows a 2-node cluster to tolerate failures on both nodes at the same time. So if that sounds interesting, we'll be demoing that tomorrow. And of course, we have this huge investment in Windows Admin Center, which gives you a lightweight management that you can realistically deploy and use in a branch office where you might have just those 2 hyper-converged servers. And all of this is to make sure that Windows Server is really the best at the edge for HCI. And yet, at the same time, right, at the same time as I say all of this, yesterday you may have seen we demoed support up to 4 petabytes of storage in a single cluster. And that's not a theoretical exercise. We actually went and built such a cluster with our friends from QCT. And that's the same exact software in those small 2-node clusters or in those very large clusters for the core data center. And so that's the scalability that allows organizations to standardize on HCI. And that's really one of the driving forces as well for why hyperconverged is becoming so popular. And last, but certainly not least, with this consolidation to hyperconverged comes a consolidation of the management experience. You can actually manage your compute, your storage, and your networking all as one integrated solution. And that's what we're delivering with Windows Admin Center for hyperconverged infrastructure. So I'd like to give you the first of 2 demos now that I will do to show you the dashboard that we've built in Windows Admin Center, especially for hyperconverged infrastructure. Let's take a look. So in Windows Admin Center, you'll see there's a connection type called a hyperconverged cluster. And I'll just open up one of those connections now. So here is the dashboard that you see that gives you an at-a-glance view of your entire cluster. At the very top, you can see we have alerts. These come from the cluster health service. In this case, you can see I have a few volumes that are filling up, but we would also get alerts for storage or network or compute there as well. We can see a summary of the health of all the relevant top-level objects. So for example, my 2 servers, which are both healthy, my 16 drives, my virtual machines, right? Of course, I need to know what state they are in, and the storage volumes, which are providing that storage to those virtual machines. And in this case, I can see I have a yellow one and a red one, which correspond to those alerts that I saw earlier. Continuing on down the dashboard, We have a section all about resource consumption, so we can see CPU usage across the entire cluster, memory usage, again, from all the hosts across the entire cluster, and storage usage across all of our storage volumes in this hyper-converged cluster. And we have performance information, so you can see IOPS, again, in aggregate, what are the storage operations that the virtual machines are requesting and getting, and the latency of those. And just as Daniel showed, these charts are, of course, fully interactive, and they have this history going back in time without you needing to set anything up. So you can see any performance data for the last hour, or the last day, week, month, and so on. And for all of these objects, you can actually drill in. So you can click, for example, on volumes, and you'll see there's a whole nother set of pages and views just dedicated to volume management, where you can see a list of your volumes and a bunch of actions that you can take. So you can, with just a couple of clicks, you can open, expand, or delete volumes. And likewise, so Daniel showed you virtual machines. This is kind of the volumes view. There are actions you can take on servers, drives, and every other object. It's not just a dashboard, right? There's this whole experience that this is really your window into. An announcement that we get to make here at Ignite this year is that the dashboard and most of these tools for hyper-converged infrastructure, they have been in preview for a while now. They are now generally available, and they're available for both Windows Server 2016 and Windows Server 2019. So you can go and download it. As Daniel said, it takes very little time. It's like 5 minutes, and you can get this up and running. And if you have a hyper-converged cluster, whether it's running 2016 or 2019, you can use this to manage it. And we're continuing to add capabilities for both versions, although, of course, some things we can only add for 2019 if it requires platform support. So with that kind of overview of hyper-converged infrastructure, I'd like to turn now and talk a little bit more specifically about Storage Spaces Direct, which is the software-defined storage piece of Microsoft's HCI platform. So this is not going to be the deepest dive, just because we only have so much time in a 45-minute session. We will be covering it, as Daniel said, in a little more detail tomorrow. But I want to give you a sense of how Windows Admin Center can take what is actually a fairly advanced technology and make it quite approachable. If you're familiar at all with Storage Spaces Direct, then you know the general idea. We start with industry standard servers. These are just the hypervisor nodes that you would be buying anyway. But what we do that's a little different is we insert a bunch of additional drives into those servers. Sort of the standard baseline configuration is to insert 2 SSDs and 4 hard drives into each of the nodes. But of course, we support much more than that as well. Now, when you do this and when you enable Storage Spaces Direct, it will automatically identify which drives are fastest and use those as a built-in read and write cache to accelerate I/O to the other drives, in this case, the hard drives. So we call the flash, in this case, the cache drives, and the hard disks are the capacity drives. And you don't have to do anything for this to happen. It happens completely automatically. So there's no manual configuration. You don't have to set up disk groups or anything like that. It just happens when you turn on Storage Spaces Direct. Now, what we're going to do with the capacity drives is we're going to want to create volumes that present to Windows like any other volume. And we're going to use that as the place where we can store our virtual machines' VHD files, for example. And so those volumes are also called storage spaces. And I'm going to give a demo in just a second of how we create those. Now, these volumes have a few special properties. The first, of course, is let's remember, we're replacing a SAN or a NAS here, right? So we want these to have fault tolerance. We want it to be where if we lose a drive or if something goes wrong, we can still access all of that data. But we want to do it with this industry standard hardware that, of course, is the promise of HCI. And so Storage Spaces Direct provides distributed software resiliency. You can think of it as it's like RAID, but easier, and you don't need a RAID card. The most basic form of distributed software resiliency is what we call two-way mirror, where we basically keep 2 copies of everything. And so we'll keep 1 copy on one node and 1 copy on the other if you have just a 2-node cluster. And all you need is 2 nodes, of course, for two-way mirror. If you have more nodes, you can do some different types. And just to emphasize, this doesn't require any specialized hardware, right? We're using local drives that are present in both of the nodes, and we're doing all of the resiliency in software. So with 2 nodes, you can do two-way mirror. With 3 nodes, you can do something very similar called three-way mirror, where we'll just keep 3 copies of everything. And if you have even more nodes, so 4 and beyond, you can do some more advanced schemes as well, such as what we call parity, or what some folks call erasure coding. And there are different advantages in terms of performance and in terms of capacity efficiency between mirroring and parity, and we won't have time to get into those today. But suffice it to say, these are basically all of the types of distributed software RAID you could expect, and all of them are available. It simply depends on how many nodes you have and how many drives you have. One more thing before we get to the demo that I want to briefly mention is when you create these volumes, these storage spaces, which have this distributed software resiliency, they're also going to be striped for parallelism across all of the capacity drives in your storage pool. And we do this to maximize performance first and foremost, but also because from a capacity planning perspective, it makes it really easy. It means that you don't have to deal with setting up RAID groups or disk groups and saying, okay, which of them is more full than the other. All of them are always equally full, and it will balance itself automatically for you. And you don't have to deal with any of this. It just will always interleave and stripe across all of the drives. So this was, I think, in the last 5 minutes, the fastest explanation I have ever tried to give of Storage Spaces Direct. And if it feels complicated or slightly overwhelming, fear not, because I'd like to show you how easy it is to get started in Windows Admin Center with Storage Spaces Direct. So we'll do a demo now of just provisioning some storage. So in Windows Admin Center, you'll see I have a cluster here that has 4 nodes. So you can see them listed 1 through 4 in the server's view, and they're from our friends at Lenovo. Now, because these are hyper-converged server nodes, they have a bunch of extra drives in them, right? And Lenovo has actually built an extension for Windows Admin Center that allows you to see specifically how those drives are arranged. And so you can see here, I guess it looks like 12 additional drives in each of these nodes, some of which are going to be SSDs and some of which are going to be hard disks. And if we go over and look in the drives view, you can see a capacity gauge for how full these drives are. And right now, they are not full at all. It's completely empty. So we have 175 terabytes of hard disk capacity. None of it's used yet. So we can get started using it by creating a volume. By default, there is this one small volume called performance history, which is, I think its name is kind of self-explanatory. It's where we store the performance history. But otherwise, we can create our first real volume. So we'll click Create, and you'll see the form that pops up is really quite short. There's just 3 fields. So we can give it a name. We can choose the resiliency, which at this point we'll just leave as three-way mirror. And we can choose the size. It can be anything. It could be 1, or we can say 10 terabytes. And you can see, because it's going to be three-way mirrored, it's going to take up 30 terabytes of space to create 10 terabytes of usable. And then we'll go ahead and click Create. Now, behind the scenes here, Storage Spaces Direct is going to go. It's going to allocate all of that 10 terabytes. It's going to do all of that 3 times for your three-way mirror. It's going to divide it into 1,000 little pieces and assign each of those pieces optimally across all the drives in your cluster. But you don't have to worry about any of that, because you just get a nice little success notification, and then the volume is created. And you can see back in that gauge of disk usage that indeed that 30 terabytes has been allocated now, because we have our 10 terabyte volume. And actually, you can see, if you look at the full list of drives, that's been allocated across all of the drives evenly. Each one of them has received a number of pieces of this volume, and we didn't have to worry about it. We can create another volume just to sort of show what different resiliency types look like. So we can call it like test 2, for example. Make it 10 terabytes, just like the last one, but let's change the resiliency. It's not that hard. We just have to choose a different option from a drop-down. But instead of three-way mirroring, we can do, for example, mirror-accelerated parity. And what you'll see is right away that'll change the footprint. Instead of taking up 30 terabytes now, it'll be a little smaller. It'll take up a little less space. It'll take up just 22. And in fact, we can even change the ratio of mirror to parity to suit our performance and capacity trade-offs that we want to make. And you'll see that'll change the footprint up to 23 down to 21 terabytes. And then just like before, even though this is now a sort of more sophisticated volume that's using erasure coding, if you want to use the fancy word, it works the same way. We click Create, Storage Spaces goes off and deals with all of it for us. And now we have both of our volumes. We can see the resiliencies. We can see that each of them is 10 terabytes. And we can see that our used storage capacity in the storage pool has our first volume of 30 footprint and then 21 more. So that sort of gives you a sense of how easily you can provision storage in Windows Admin Center with really just a couple of clicks. And so when you think about going from Hyper-V to hyper-converged infrastructure, and enabling Storage Spaces Direct, which is already included in the latest versions of Windows Server, what you'll see is it's really quite easy. The cache drives, the cache mode, all of that behavior is set automatically. Capacity drives are automatically added into a storage pool, which is always automatically balanced. You can create, open, expand, or delete volumes with just a few clicks, and you never have to worry about some of the complexities of traditional storage provisioning, like striping or interleave. All of that is taken care of for you. So if this sounds appealing, if you're interested in making that transition from Hyper-V to hyper-converged infrastructure, here are a few things that you can do to get started today. The first is I would really encourage you to download Windows Admin Center. You can do that by going to aka.ms/Windows Admin Center, which you can use for Windows Server 2016 or 2019 for hyper-converged infrastructure. And many of the other tools actually go even further down level to 2012 R2 and beyond. And you can also think about procuring hardware for hyper-converged infrastructure, which you can do in two different ways. You can either build your own by picking parts from the Windows Server catalog that have the Windows Server logo as well as the software-defined data center additional qualifications. Or the path that we really recommend is to go with an offer from one of our partners that's been pre-validated and is ready to go. So we've been working with all of the leading server vendors in the industry. We have over a dozen partners, 6 of whom are new this year. And together, they've run extensive and lengthy stress testing on over 50 different platforms, server platforms, that they've pre-validated to work with hyper-converged infrastructure on Windows Server. And you can browse all of those on our new and improved website, microsoft.com/WSSD for Windows Server Software Defined. So if you're thinking about procuring hardware for hyper-converged infrastructure, this is absolutely the first place that you should go look. In addition to installing Windows Admin Center or checking out the available hardware that's sort of ready to go today, there are 3 more sessions where you can learn about each of these topics in more detail. So if you're interested in learning more about Windows Admin Center, that session is later today at 4 o'clock. You can also learn more about Storage Spaces Direct tomorrow morning. I'll be giving a deep dive session, and my colleague Greg will be talking about software-defined networking later tomorrow, again with a 75-minute deep dive session. Okay, so with that, thank you all very much for joining us, and enjoy the rest of Ignite.